Hi and welcome to Retvlog. This is the weekly Retribution Paladin vlog answering your questions in between the live Retribution Paladin Q&As. Now, news on that at the end of the video when the next live Ret Q&A is, because it's going to be quite soon now. First of all, before we get into the question I'm going to talk about today, which is regarding talents, someone tweeted me this, a picture of this. No to the shoulders, no to the boots, no to the combination of shoulders and boots, no to everything in between the shoulders and boots. Fortunately, the person who did tweet this did have to explain that it wasn't their transmog. I initially thought it was theirs. They've been a little bit sarcastic on that, but no. Okay, on to the question. So, the question was, what do you think about the current lack of possibilities in talents on Ret? I'm in a guild that does 3 weekly raids and are doing mythic progress for on Iron at the moment. The main issue I have is that I have 2 setups of talents that are viable. Zeal plus Bow for a single target and Greater Judgment plus Divine Hammer for AoE. There are a lot of talents that are just useless, such as Virtue's Blade, which has been nerfed for some reason, blah, 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 or Justical's Vengeance. Others are potentially strong, but never a good idea to take. For example, Holy Wrath. Is Crusade too strong? Is there another reason for Blizzard not looking at our talents outside of Nerf Crusade and all its components? Well, it's a good question. Talents are, of course, a thorny issue. They were a very thorny issue, for example, during the alpha. I remember discussing on the forums where actually people from the EU could actually discuss things on the North American forums because they put you all into one thing if you're on the alpha or the beta, and basically they just hit this brick wall whenever you criticised, in particular, Greater Blessing of Might, and surprise, surprise, that disappeared, and some of these talents, and some of them are dead talents. Now, I'm going to go through all the talents and sort of discuss some of the issues with them, because I sort of lump talents into 4 categories, really. There's the ones that are actually useful. We use them. Sometimes we use them a lot. Sometimes we use them every now and then. But we use them. Then there's the talents which, in theory, are useful, but in practice are not. So these are ones where if you were to design the talents in isolation, you would think, well, there's nothing wrong with that talent in this situation. It could be useful. And I think these talents exist because I've become increasingly suspicious throughout Legion that there is no connection between the class design team, who would be designing the talents and tweaking the talents, and the encounter design team, for which you're going to need them, particularly mythic raiding and high level dungeon keys, and you know, hard mode PvP as well. These are but for PvP they have their own talents. So if ever there was something up with the talents, the normal talents that we all get, they could always tweak the PvP stuff. So really what we're talking about is pushing high keys in Mythic Plus dungeons and Mythic mode raiding, where you really need your talents to be on song. The third type are the ones that are perfectly good talents, but they just face too much competition in their road, because you can't just look at a talent in isolation and say, is this a decent talent? You have to compare it with what else is there to take. And we all know what I'm talking about here. And then the fourth one are just talents that are just useless. You know, it's like, even if you were to be given this talent, it didn't have any competition with it, it's like a baseline ability, you still wouldn't use it much because you know what, it's crap. And we all know what I'm talking about there as well. So let's go through this. So in the first row, you've got Final Verdict, Execution Centers, Consecration. On first glance, what this should be is quite clear. Okay, so Execution Centers for single target, Consecration for AoE, Final Verdict, where it's a bit of a mix of the both. And you would expect Final Verdict to be used on, say, most raid bosses and most dungeons where you can't change talents anyway, because sometimes you're just going to be hitting one target, a boss, then ads come in, so then you want to be able to Divine Stun. Perfectly sensible talent. Nothing wrong with that. But when it's a pure single target fight, why don't we use Execution Centers? Well, I mean, they have tried buffing it a couple of times in Legion. You can sort of take it. Like, if it's a shortish fight and pure single target, like Goroth, for example. Goroth, you could, if you wanted to min-max, you could take Execution Centers on Goroth. There's not a lot else there. You know, not a lot else. Sometimes I've thought Mistress Assassine, because sometimes out of necessity you're having to move out of range. Well, if you're having to move out of range, it's time to use Execution Centers, where you can use that from range. As well as the judgment that's necessary to make sure you've got the debuff on it as well, so that's okay. But the big problem Execution Sentence suffers from is the Ashbringer traits. Because via the Ashbringer traits, Templar's Verdict is buffed twice. There's 2 different traits that buff Templar's Verdict. You know, Divine Storm when it comes to it is that. And that means that you'd have to... You know, Blizzard would have had to have buffed Execution Centers quite a lot to make it competitive, especially as Execution Centers takes more skill than just using Templar's Verdict. Because Execution Centers, you've got to make sure that not only do you get good use out of it, and remember the cooldown is going to change quite a lot depending on your haste, because you can reduce it quite low down, but the time it takes to fall, which is also affected by haste, and remember, you get any in-game special haste like heroism or something like that, then that affects it as well. You've got to make sure the Judgment debuff is active when it lands, not when you fire it off. Templar's Verdict, as long as the Judgment debuff's there when you fire it off, you're fine. Now, admittedly, with our haste levels now, I mean, there's still quite a variety, but certainly my haste levels, there's not a very large window between Judgment debuffs. The chances of it falling down the cracks there are slim. But this is a problem that's only going to get worse in the next tier, where we're expected to be going for much higher mastery builds. If your Judgment debuff is missing when this thing lands, it means it's obviously going to do less damage. But how much less damage depends on how much mastery you've got. If you've got quite a lot of mastery, then it's very costly. If you don't have very much mastery, it's not as costly. Next tier, we're expected to have quite a lot of mastery, which some people may be quite pleased about. So that's the issue with Execution Sentence. It is virtually a dead talent in reality, simply because it cannot compete with Templar's Verdict. And that's all there is to it. Consecration is the classic case of a talent that absolutely looks fine, and you think, you know, okay, in this situation it would be fine, you would take it. But those situations just don't exist. Tichondrius in Nighthold was an example of where you could get some use out of Consecration. If you were going to be the one DPS in the bats, Consecration absolutely useful in that. Because you don't have to think of it being useful all fight as well. If there's a particular part of the fight when there's ads and they need to die really quickly, but it's not easy to get them to die really quickly, then Consecration could be useful. And as I say, the bats on Tichondrius was a classic case. But we haven't had those situations in Tomb of Sargeras. And we generally don't get those situations. In fact, Tichondrius is the only example that I can really seriously think about. So that's, I think, an issue with the disconnect between, you know, encounter design and class design. Now, dungeons is what I would be thinking more for this, but again, the problem is you're quite mobile in dungeons. If the Consecration followed you around, then I would think Mythic Plus dungeons, especially with Fortified or anything where you want to get the ads down as quickly as possible, like teaming, stuff like that, then Consecration would actually be quite good. But because it doesn't follow you around, and especially with summer fixes, you don't want to be stood still with ads anyway. And the tank certainly doesn't like, you know, raging and necrotic and things like that, which we've got this week. They're not going to want to stand still and stand toe-to-toe with everything. If you've got Sanguine, you don't want to be doing that either. So Consecration in most realistic situations becomes useless. So what you basically do is take Final Verdict all the time. And it's not because Final Verdict's stupendously strong, it just buffs your Divine Storm and your Templar's Verdict. It's just that the other two, one of them is just too weak, and the other one is not useful in practical situations. On to the next row. So you've got Fires of Justice, Zeal, and Greater Judgment. Now, all of these at some point have been useful, so I'm not going to knock any of these too much. Obviously, Fires of Justice, it does a couple of things, but the chief thing that is taken for is if you expect to have a lot of downtime. So it goes quite well, for example, with Divine Hammer. Divine Hammer has a much longer cooldown than other forms of Blade of Justice. So you take Fires of Justice in that case to make sure that you've got your Crusader Strike for building up Holy Power in between. Otherwise, you can end up with a lot of downtime, which is why when you talked about using Greater Judgment with Divine Hammer, that's not a usual thing. Now, I'm not going to categorically say, okay, use this talent, don't use this combination of talents. You should sim things, certainly, to give yourself an idea. But it would be unusual to take Divine Hammer and Greater Judgment. For example, in dungeons at the moment, I don't take Divine Hammer, but I'll come to that when I talk about that tier. So Fires of Justice is when you've either got very low haste or you're using Divine Hammer just to keep your rotation ticking over. Zeal is now, and Fires of Justice was the standard choice for most of Legion, up until about Tomb of Sargeras, in which case Zeal became more the norm. In fact, so much the norm that that's the one I take on all raid fights. I do use Greater Judgment now because of the change to Mastery, the buff to Mastery that we've had via Judgment. I do take Greater Judgment in Mythic dungeons if trash is an issue. So that sort of depends on the dungeon. Also the affixes, it's fortified this week, you know. But I take it with Blade of Wrath usually when I do that at the moment. Greater Judgment is likely to get more use in the next tier because of our set bonus. It still remains to be seen whether it's going to be our 2 or 4 set. At the moment it's our 2 set bonus. I strongly suspect it's going to be our 4 set bonus. I think they're going to swap them over again. But basically it's buffing Judgment by 60%. Now that's quite a lot. That's going to make Judgment a very, very hard hitter. Very hard hitter. It's also going to mean that our finishers hit harder. It's also going to encourage us. Again, at the moment, see, we've already been in a situation in Legion where we've looked about thinking about a mastery heavy build, and then they and it was to do with the set bonus, and then they changed the set bonus, and all of a sudden we didn't. It's getting quite late on for them to do that now, but don't rule it out. But at the moment, we are looking like having a lot. So all that gear you've been getting that's got mastery from your mythic cache, and you're going, oh, don't delete it. If it's high item level, I've been keeping it. My bags are rammed with mastery gear because I'm hoping to be able to switch to it when I get my set bonuses from Taurus. So Greater Judgment may even get use in single target fights as a result of the fact that it's like this reverse execute thing that it does. You know, it's guaranteed crits on mobs above 50%. Now that's not brilliant. It could certainly do with the rework. Apart from anything else, it's going to devalue crit, isn't it? A little bit. I mean, crit was still going to be helping the rest of your damage, but you're going to get to a situation here where Judgment is going to be your most damaging ability with certain builds, with certain gear builds. So yeah, you probably in this case want haste mastery as opposed to, at the moment, you lean more towards haste crit. On to the next tier. There's nothing really wrong, especially with the next tier, even though there's one thing we take almost all the time, which is Fist of Justice. Fist of Justice, single target stun. It's the one we've had since day one. Does what it needs to do. It's a decent enough stun. The idea that it lasts for a decent amount of time as well. And the idea that by using your spenders, by actively DPSing, you can get the cooldown down. I always think in Neltharian's Lair, I always notice this much more because on these Scorpids at the end that do the ability that you can stun, I've forgotten what it's called now, you hear a little shout go out. I can usually stun every single one of those, but what I have to do when I stun it, I then pad in, make sure I'm spending, so that it's up again in time for the next one. Repentance, I mean, the Mage Tower is useful on the Mage Tower encounter. It's a super niche thing. It's always a super niche thing. You don't generally get much crowd control use in raids, and even in dungeons now, the idea of a crowd control that can be broken by damage is not popular because when Mythic Plus dungeons have been talked about and everyone thought, okay, we're going back to a time when dungeons were much more difficult now and we're going to have to be coordinated and talk to each other like people had to do with just normal dungeons in vanilla. But one feature of the ones in vanilla is you would often crowd control as well. So you'd see a pack of mobs. You wouldn't generally want to just go in and start tanking it all. You'd actually want to crowd control as much as you can and then pull the rest back to you. But that doesn't happen in Mythic Plus dungeons because there's the time element. So you're up against the clock. So you still effectively want to go in. So any crowd control you use has to be the sort of stuff that can't be broken. In general, unless it's a really nasty pack and you have to be sensible and bugger the time. If you're like pushing a super high one. But generally speaking, yeah, you're not going to get much use out of Repentance. But at the same time, you know, that's because the very nature of that sort of crowd control is largely redundant, but not completely. So when you do need it, well, it's there for you. Blinding Light, of course, is virtually useless. I don't know whether it's got any PvP applications, but again, PvP stuff should be in the PvP talents. In PvE, I can't think of any major use. It's one of those that might have some theoretical use. I mean, the last time I can remember really using it was on Garrosh in Mists of Pandaria, Siege of Orgrimmar. So, But at the same time, Fist of Justice is a perfectly good talent. So even if you put something better in Blinding Light, unless it was going to be an AoE stun, but we're not going to get an AoE stun because, again, this idea of not having the same abilities on different classes, trying to make them unique as far as possible, means that our stun is a single target stun. Fair enough. On to the next tier. So, yeah, Virtue's Blade is redundant, and it's basically been redundant all this time. Just the concept of it, I just don't think is going to compete with Blade of Wrath. I mean, the thing is, Blade of Wrath is very good for what it does. Divine Hammer, in theory, is very good for what it does, but they've kept nerfing it to the point where I don't use it for anything now. It's been up and down, Divine Hammer. There's been times when I've used it all the time in dungeons, regardless of affixes. Then there was a time when I didn't use it at all. Then there was a time when I did, because I think they bugged it, actually. Then there was a time when I did again, and now I don't again. And they really can't seem to quite tune Divine Hammer right. It's one of those things where if they get it a bit wrong, it becomes massively powerful. There was a period of time where you could even use it on a pure single target boss, because it lost you almost nothing. So people, for example, will take it on Croesus in Nighthold, because even though there are some ads, the ads don't generally last very long, but you lost so little single target damage, it was like negligible, that it was worth it for the few seconds of the fight when there were ads to cleave. People would use it for that. Now it's gone. Obviously, that couldn't be allowed to continue. They had to nerf that. That was just silly. But now, yeah, it's the point where I wouldn't advise taking it on a 2-target fight, and there'd have to be ads up a lot of the time. You'd have to be like teaming fortified or something for me to even think about taking it a dungeon. But because I tend to favour Greater Judgment now, I don't even do that, because I don't think Greater Judgment with Divine Hammer, unless you've got a right load of haste, is very comfortable for me. I mean, if you want to use that, then that's fine. But yeah, so at the moment it's basically Blade of Wrath. I use Blade of Wrath for everything. I don't touch that talent though. But Divine Hammer in theory is okay. That's, I think, a tuning thing. Virtue's Blade is not, but it's also difficult to come up with something that can compete with either Blade of Wrath or Divine Hammer. I think it's just one of these situations where Blade of Wrath and Divine Hammer have covered all situations. So what do you put for your third tier? Your third talent in that tier, sorry. This is a tricky one. On to the next one. So this is where we've got Justicar's Vengeance, Eye for an Eye, Word of Glory. Now, Justicar's Vengeance, obviously damage-wise, it suffers from the same problem as Execution Sentence, in that it used to be okay under certain situations before, but with the Ashbringer traits, as soon as we started getting Ashbringer traits, right at the start of the Legion, then Templar's Verdict is being buffed by 2 traits, as well as potentially a talent. We take Final Verdict, and then that's the third thing, buffing Templar's Verdict. Because what those traits really should have done was just buff our spenders, instead of buffing specific ones. So the talented spenders don't get any benefit from those traits, which is why it's fallen behind. So even against a stunned mob, the Justicar's Vengeance should, unless you've got a really weird gear set up, do more damage than a Templar's Verdict, but not by much, and not enough really to be worth the extra holy power spent. So what Justicar's Vengeance is a self-heal. As a self-heal, it's fine, okay? Like when you're soloing stuff, I use this if I'm soloing rares or something like that on Argus. It's quite useful when you need a bit of a self-heal just to be able to use that. It's pretty good for that. PvP, obviously, it's really good for as well, because you can stun someone, use Justicar's Vengeance on them, and you're healed up, virtually to full. So it's, as well as doing a load of damage to them. So it's really good for that as well. Eye for an Eye, same issue as when I was talking about Divine Shield last week. It's a damage reduction. Damage reductions are fantastic. I miss the fact that we no longer really have one. But it's a physical one only. The extra effect about counter-attacking is pointless for PvE. That's clearly a PvP type thing. Yes, there are times in solo, of course, if something's going to be beaten on you. But again, when you're soloing, my recommendation is for Justicar's Vengeance, not Eye for an Eye. So Eye for an Eye gets its use on Mistress of Scene. So it's useful from the point of view, there is a fight, and a difficult fight as well, where it is useful. But generally speaking, in raids and dungeons, the fatal damage, or potentially fatal damage, is not physical. Occasionally it is, but generally it's not. So the two types in Tomb of Sargeras is the Hydra Shot from Mistress Asine, for which this is useful. You can't use it on everyone, but if you sort of maybe use it sparingly, and then maybe if you get into a Hydra Shot and you're not convinced there's enough people in it, use it then, it might save your life. Obviously the other big one is the Armageddon Hail on Kil'jaeden, but this isn't going to protect you from that really, unless you massively overgear it, and it's not at all on Mythic. So your only chance there is to immune it with Divine Shield or Bop, in which case Eye for an Eye is not going to do anything extra there. Word of Glory, more useful in dungeons than raids, I would say. Some people do use it in raids. And if you're not going to use the other two, you might as well equip it. You could do. Obviously, my issue has always been, one, it's a short range, so you're only really going to be helping other melee there. But melee do tend to be grouped, and if there's like studying shit, then it might help that out. Obviously, it's got the holy power cost, and it's got the cooldown, 1 minute cooldown with the reach, 2 charges. Now, to my mind, it should not have both of those, one or the other. Either give it the cooldown and the recharge time, and don't have it cost anything, in which case we could call it actual utility because we could do it without affecting our DPS too strongly, other than the global cooldown it uses. Or we keep the holy power cost and it's spammable. It doesn't do a massive amount of damage. We're not going to be breaking the bank with this. But that would, again, make it useful utility-wise, because we could do in an intense healing part of the fight, we could be helping out there, not doing very much damage, other than building holy power, but helping out with the healing. So, to my mind, Word of Glory can get use. So I'm not going to say it's not a dead talent. It can get use, particularly in dungeons. But it would be better if it either didn't have the recharge time or it didn't have the holy power cost. One or the other. On to the next row. This is the one for which there is, ironically, the most competition on a fight-by-fight basis. But mostly between Divine Intervention and Cavalier. So, partway through the expansion, they swapped in Judgment of Light for another dead talent. But Judgment of Light has become a dead talent. Even though, as a talent, it's quite nice. This is a classic case of being up against too much competition. Judgment of Light sounds quite nice, but think about the situation you use it. So, would you use it on Progress? Well, on Progress, you probably want to be using Divine Intervention to cover any, like, blushes. Okay, people can die every now and then. If a Divine Intervention will protect you from that, then that's what you should probably use. The longer people stay alive, the longer into the fight you push, the more you learn. If movement is an issue, and a movement is an issue on a number of fights, then of course Cavalier. Now, ironically, there's only one fight on Mythic where on Progress it's bad to have Divine Intervention, as I found to my cost, which is Maiden. Because the problem is when someone does something bad on Maiden, it almost certainly wipes the entire raid. But of course it doesn't wipe you because your bubble will proc. But what that means is they all get away without a repair bill. When your bubble wears off, you will then die to the Maiden and you'll get a repair bill. So it ends up being quite costly. So you get rid of Divine Intervention. So then you might think, well, do you use Divine Judgment of Light? No. Because although it's not a heavy movement fight, when there is movement to be done, it's a lot of it. You're right around the other end of the room. So having Cavalier, having the double charge there, can actually be really useful. So you'd switch to Cavalier there. There are other fights where Cavalier can be useful, and it's like a balance between, do you take Cavalier, do you take Divine Intervention? Like Kil'jaeden Mythic, I'm progressing on at the moment. And generally speaking, you'd look at that. Well, there is movement there, so yeah, take Cavalier. The issue is, for me, I'm not taking that one at the moment. I'd like to. The issue is I'm more likely to die to someone cocking something up with orbs, or indeed me doing it myself, or something like that, than I am to need the extra charge of Divine Steed. Because in actual fact, the movement, as long as you're very aware of what's going on, and I do use my speedy boost, but that's a safeguard. Again, most of the time I don't need it. Then I don't actually have an issue getting to where I need to get to on it. As long as I'm very aware, I don't have many get out of jail card free for that. So if I use a Divine Steed, which I very rarely do, but when I do use a Divine Steed, I am thinking to myself, I hope we don't get another awkwardly placed Singularity, because in the next 45 seconds anyway. So then that brings us on to the last talent row. Oh, well, actually, no, one more thing I will talk about that, actually, because this is part of Blizzard's philosophy. So the idea of Divine Intervention and Cavalier competing with each other. I think stems from Blizzard's statement during beta, I think it was. It's alpha or beta. It's before Legion launched. That basically movement and survivability are the same thing in their view. And it's a combination of them. Their argument is that you can either have high survivability and low mobility, or low survivability and high mobility. Now, of course, that doesn't quite work out because there are some classes that have high for both. I don't think there are any that have low for both, if I think about it. Because if you think about the ones that tend to have the lower survivability, like say shamans, they tend to have pretty good movement options. So yeah, but there are some that have high for both. And again, the argument is that you can choose, like if something's coming in that needs you to move really quickly, well, you can either move out of it really quickly, or if you're not capable of doing that, then you can just stay in it with your high survivability. Problem is, it doesn't really work, because if your survivability has a very long cooldown, then that's fine for the first one. What about the next one? But anyway. The other thing is, so the final tier, now you can see here, of course, I've got two talents here, because I'm at the point at which I took this screenshot, I've got the Soul of the High Lord, which is one I'm using increasingly at the moment. But we've got Divine Purpose, Crusade, and Holy Wrath. Now, all of them very, very different talents. The Divine Purpose talent is a talent that exists in here because people asked for it. It wasn't originally in when they were, when Alpha went open and the Retribution Paladin was one of the early specs you could try. Divine Purpose was nowhere to be seen. A lot of people asked for it, complained for it, and then along it came. So this is directly as a result of people asking for it. They enjoy the prop-based gameplay. But it never gets used. Unless you've got this Soul of the High Lord. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because it's just not strong enough to match Crusade. Now, on the other side of Crusade, you've got Holy Wrath. This is a different kettle of fish altogether. This is dreadful. There was it being a dead... People criticise it for being a dead talent. I am delighted it's a dead talent. Absolutely delighted. I'm not delighted there is a dead talent slot, but I am delighted that Holy Wrath is a dead talent, because it's an awful talent. Because there was a point in Alpha where we feared that it might actually be a good talent to take in terms of raw damage it would do. But think about the concept of it. The whole concept is a nightmare, and you have to wonder how it got past committee. And yet the big problem with this, we were, unlike with Greater Blessing of Might, we were never going to get rid of this, because two extremely senior designers backed it to the hilt. They were saying how great a talent it was, when that was absolute nonsense. But as soon as they were saying that, you knew that this thing was never disappearing, because they'd lose face. How you'd have to use Holy Wrath. So for those who might not know, because you've never taken it, it's on a cooldown, and when you use it, however much health you've lost, you do that, or you do damage based on it. It's actually more damage than that. So how you'd have to use this, because it does damage, you'd have to use it on cooldown. But to get the best damage out of it, you have to have lost a load of health. Now, they did change it a little bit, because it used to be the case, it was literally based on how much health you've lost. Now, there's a sort of, it does a maximum of like 200% of your health or something. So, you don't need to actually lose almost all your health. But you still need to lose a fair amount of it. So you're going to want to use it on the pull. So how are you going to do it on the pull? Obvious, you're going to taunt, aren't you? You're going to get the boss to smack you, use your Holy Wrath, tell the healers not to heal you up too quickly, use your Holy Wrath, get the other tank to taunt off it. Can you imagine that? So you've now got several people in the raid who are having to change their normal behaviour so that you can use your ability. Straight away, that's a nightmare. But then it comes on cooldown later on in the fight. What are you going to do? Are you going to, I mean, some bosses will allow you to do it naturally. So some bosses you can say, don't heal me, you can go and stand in fire or something. Or if the boss does a cleave, like Fellclaws and kill Jaden, you can stand in that, let it get you low on health, then tell the healers to heal you up. But again, you're still asking healers to heal or not heal you. And of course, the odd smart heal will go astray anyway. The whole thing was a nightmare. To actually use this reliably was a nightmare. And the best way to do it would have been to tie it in with Divine Intervention. At the time when Divine Intervention had a 2.5 minute cooldown, and you could do this, then it would be like, you know, taunt the boss, get it to smack you, your bubble procs, you use it immediately, and you know, let the other tank then get it back off you, which would be easy because you've just proc Divine Intervention. But then that means you haven't got your bubble available for other things. The whole concept was a nightmare. The whole concept was totally unworkable. And this is one that surely will die. This will disappear. It's difficult simply to say exactly what would happen in the next expansion, because in the next expansion, talents themselves may work very differently. We shouldn't assume that we're basically going to have the same talent system. We may not. Bear in mind, we've had a change to the talent system, sort of, in Legion, because we've had the PvP talents. We've also had the Ashbringer traits. The Ashbringer's disappearing. So are we going to get something else to replace it? Or are they going to redesign the talent system again anyway? So those are my thoughts on that one, in terms of where I think the problems are with the different talents. The next live Ret Q&A is going to be in 2 weeks today as I put this up. That's going to be Saturday the 11th of November. The idea of that is it's after BlizzCon, so we'll be able to discuss, and it's also just before on Taurus, so we'll be able to discuss not only the implications of what might be revealed at BlizzCon, although we're not going to get any spec-specific information, I want to thought, but we can also discuss how we're likely to be going to Antorus. Things should be firmed up then, and although we know they can change things at the 11th hour, they can even change things even after release, and they've done so. We can still discuss, as the information is at the time, what we're going to be wanting to do, what gear we're wanting to be going for, what stats we're going to be wanting to go for, and all the rest of it then. So that's going to be Saturday the 11th of November, 7 PM UK time. I'll see you then. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.